Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Sunscreen e-Summit. My name is Carl D. Ruiz. I'm with DSM, and I'll be giving an overview of the U.S. Landscape for sunscreens and talking about what the future may hold with regard to sunscreens in the U.S. In terms of today's agenda, I'll go over an overview of how sunscreens are regulated in the U.S. and abroad, a history of the FDA OTC sunscreen monograph, an overview of the 2021 sunscreen monograph proposed order, an indication of what's happening with 7 ingredients that are being supported by the PCPC sunscreen monograph, some innovation incentives that have been introduced under the 2021 proposed order, and then some new sunscreen innovation activities associated with the possible addition of a new UV filter called BEMT in the United States. Before I go there, I just thought I'd highlight on the right a hieroglyphic from Egypt, and the use of sunscreens, interestingly, dates back to the ancient Egyptians who used aloe vera, olive, lotus oil, inorganic clays, rice bran extracts, and mineral powders as photoprotectants. So this is truly not a new art in terms of putting together sunscreens, but it has been done for a very long time, as you can see, and in many cases thousands of years. Okay, so let's look at the regulatory landscape in terms of overview of how UV filters are regulated in the U.S. In the U.S., UV filters are regulated as a drug because they fall in the definition of what a drug is on the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, which is basically articles intended for the cure, mitigation, diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of disease. In this case, prevention. The primary indication for sunscreen is sunburn, but there is also additional indications associated with skin cancer. And those are to help prevent sunburn or decrease the risk of skin cancer and early aging or skin aging caused by the sun. They're primarily regulated under the FDA's OTC drug monograph process. In other regions of the world, importantly, it's important to note that sunscreen products and UV filters are primarily regulated as cosmetics, not drugs. And on the right, you see the different countries in terms of how sunscreens are regulated. In both the US and Canada, they're regulated as either OTC drugs or natural health products. And then, as you can see, for most other countries, they're regulated cosmetics, which is a big difference in terms of what's required. And the US does require a lot more data than some of the other countries where they're not regulated as drugs. Okay, so let's go over the OTC sunscreen monograph. And this has been something that's been going on for 50 years in terms of the monograph. The monograph process was established in 1972 by FDA as a ways of facilitating the marketing of a formulation containing several ingredients in 80 therapeutic categories, one of which was sunscreens. And the first sunscreen monograph was created in 1978 via proposed rulemaking. That was finalized, well, there was a tentative final monograph issued in 1993, which was then finalized in 1999. And then we went to 2001, and there was a partial stay of that 99 final monograph. And then in 2011, there was a final rule regarding the labeling and SPF claims for sunscreens. In 2014, the Non-Prescription Drugs Advisory Committee met since Congress did pass the Sunscreen Innovation Act to review exactly what was necessary to determine whether a sunscreen was generally recognized as safe and effective. And it wasn't until 2016 that FDA did issue the what is now known as the OTC sunscreen safety and effectiveness data guidance. And then in 2019, which was rather recently, they did issue another guidance, which is subject, which is also required for demonstrating the grace of status of sunscreens, called the topical MUST guidance, maximum usage trial guidance for active ingredients. And in 2020, the CARES Act came about, an OTC reform, which led to where we are today with an FDA deemed final order, which includes the deemed final order is actually the 1999 final monograph, and a proposed sunscreen order, which is forward-looking, that would finalize the monograph, and I'll go over that in detail. Full history is located at this website here at FDA. It's kind of cumbersome, but if you want to take a dive into it, please feel free. In terms of the number of available filters in the US, they've actually decreased over time. So if we go back to 1978, there were 21. In 93, there were 20. In 1999, there were 16. In 2019, there were 14. And as of the latest rendition of the proposed order, there are still only 14. These are kind of highlighted on the right. The first two actually were eliminated in terms of category 2, not safe and effective. There are today only two mineral sunscreens which are demonstrated as being GRACE, and that's category 1, which means they're both safe and effective. And then there's 7 filters which are being supported by the Personal Care Products Consortium, and those are category 3, which means that insufficient data exists to classify them either as category 1 or 2, and the industry is working with FDA to provide data requested. There's one additional ingredient, Rationale, which is independently being supported. And then there are 3 other ingredients on the bottom there, as you see, which are not marketed very widely and not supported by industry. They're not easy to formulate. They have odor issues, and they're not really pertinent with regards to any current sunscreens on the market. So as we can see, we have a very limited palette of sunscreens today, which we're going to use to formulate safe and effective broad spectrum sunscreens that consumers actually want to use, that are aesthetically pleasing, and this is something which I'll talk about in terms of what's going on with that later. Okay, so what happened in 2021 with the proposed order and GRACE status and testing requirements that FDA indicated were necessary for the category 3 sunscreen actives? And remember, those are the ones which FDA feels as though additional data are needed. So we have human clinical studies which are needed. These include the dermal safety studies, human absorption studies. These are pharmacokinetic studies, which measure the maximum absorption on the maximum conditions of use, or the MUST. And then they also said, well, you also, given that sunscreens are chronic use products, either used 6 months continuously or 6 months intermittently, we feel as though, FDA said that they feel as though they need dermal carcinogenicity, systemic development and reproductive toxicity, toxicokinetics data, hormonal effects data. And these were all things that were highlighted in the 2016 GRACE guidelines as requirements for any UV filter, including new UV filters introduced to the monograph in order to demonstrate GRACE status. Other tests that also required were in vitro penetration tests, pediatric data on the case-by-case basis, and that's mostly dependent on the margin of safeties that are calculated, and some post-marketing data with regards to safety. So this is kind of right now what FDA is looking as being required for all existing new sunscreen filters that are on the monograph. And why did they ask for this, you might ask? And the rationale was, this was the safety framework that was supported in the 2014 NDAC meeting, Non-Prescription Drug Advisory Committee, that came about as a result of the Sunscreen Innovation Act being passed, and there being a requirement for FDA to actually provide guidance with regards to how long it takes to get a sunscreen approved and what are the actual studies. This also aligns and extends with the Sunscreen Innovation Act determination requirements that have been issued, and I indicated previously as being required to demonstrate GRACE. FDA also indicated that there were patterns of changing use in sunscreens, which indicated more frequent and longer use, evolving scientific knowledge, and then they're now highly sensitive and validated bioanalytical methods, which can be used to basically determine if sunscreens are being absorbed. And FDA did conduct some studies, maximum usage trials, which were pharmacokinetic studies, which showed taking products off the shelf that UV filters in these products were absorbed through the skin at a level of greater than 0.5 nanograms per milliliter. And in their view, this requires additional assessments of systemic effects given the absorption, which would include carcinogenicity, endocrine activity, and reproductive and developmental effects. So as you can see, this is very complicated for products that have been used over 50 years in humans. It's kind of disruptive in terms of now having to go back and assess what the studies the FDA has indicated were needed and what the results of those would be. This is it's getting very technical here, but when we look at the pharmacokinetic and the maximum usage trial requirements that FDA has implemented, and these are basically the blood absorption studies. Why is the maximum usage trial a must? And there are two things. There is a clinical significance, according to FDA, and a regulatory utility. In terms of the clinical, the must is FDA's standards approach for assessing in vivo bioavailability of topical drug products and measuring the systemic absorption potential of topically applied active ingredients that are under consideration in an OTC monograph. The absorption value that FDA has indicated they look at as a regulatory threshold that has clinical significance is 0.5 nanograms per mil, which is the highest plasma level below which the carcinogenic risk of any unknown compound would be less than 1 in 100,000 after a single dose. And these are based on threshold of toxicological concern concepts that have been introduced for impurities in the ICH International Conference of Harmonization Guidance for Industry in reviewing actually drugs, formulated drugs and RX products. So this is now something that has taken from that and now put into play with regards to OTC UV filters and active ingredients or active ingredients. Now, what's the regulatory utility of this threshold, you might ask? Well, in terms of the results of the pilot and pivotal must studies, which are required to be performed for each active ingredient, FDA takes the results of those studies together with data from other long-term non-clinical studies, and then they can estimate a margin of safety for systemic exposure to the active ingredient and determine whether additional data are needed to support a GRACE determination or finding for an active ingredient. If, for example, the must study shows that a sunscreen active is not absorbed systemically, some aspects of toxology testing may not be needed. So there is a saving grace that if you're above the 0.5 nanograms per mil level in terms of the results, then you would be eligible for exclusion of certain of the animal tests. For example, a systemic CARC study would not be required if the must studies show a steady state blood level of less than 0.5 nanograms per mil, and the existing tox data does not reveal any of the safety signals for the ingredient or any structurally similar compound, i.e. metabolite, indicating a potential for adverse events at lower levels. So this is very complicated, but in sum, if you're above 0.5, FDA perceives their need of having additional animal and toxicological tests. If you're below, that indicates that they may not be such a high risk, and then some of those studies can be waived. Just remember that as we go forward. So let's talk about the 2021 sunscreen proposed order timeline. So this actually started in 2019 with the tentative final monograph, and then in 2020 the CARES Act reformed OTC programs at FDA and mandated a proposed order type structure, eliminating the tentative final monograph structure, which was based on rulemaking. And the proposed order, which is now in place, is substantially consistent with the 2019 tentative final monograph. Actually, it's almost verbatim. But we have to realize that there's no deadline to finalize the 2021 proposed order. So, you know, if we look at that 50-year timeline, this is continuing to go on. And when the final order is issued, it must have an effective date of 1 year after the publication. So it would only become effective 1 year after it's finalized. So whenever that might be in the future, that's something we have to look forward to. Now, in terms of FDA active ingredient deferrals for category 3 ingredients on the monograph, these were all part of the proposed order, but FDA has indicated if it receives satisfactory indication of timely and diligent progress on the necessary studies for a specific ingredient, then it would be prepared to initially defer issuance of a revised final order regarding the status of sunscreen containing that ingredient, and those would be reviewed annually. So basically, FDA has indicated that all the sunscreens that are on the 1999 final monograph, which is deemed ordered, require a GRACE testing, as I indicated before. But if industry shows progress towards providing that data, then those ingredients would independently be deferred from any further rulemaking, kind of put into a box where they would be kind of held there until all the studies were done and an indication as to whether they were GRAS or not was made, whereas the rest of the monograph would go forward and be finalized in whatever timeline FDA sees fit. And that deferral would go on until all the studies were done and would need to be reviewed annually, so FDA would need to be convinced of the fact that progress was being made. Very complicated. So what has the industry done? Well, in 2019, the Personal Care Products Council did establish a sunscreen consortium to support the safety and deferral from rulemaking of 7 ingredients. These are the ones highlighted there: avo, benzone, all the way through oxybenzone. Currently, non-clinical and clinical work plans have been developed to address FDA requests for data in those areas, and the consortia, which I am the chair of, is currently engaging with FDA on proposed data request approaches, and we're actually currently having conversations and feedback with regards to several of the things that we have proposed. So the idea is hopefully we'll have a deferral and then we'll move forward with doing the tests that they have indicated are required. In terms of innovation incentives, the 2021 proposed order has provided new innovation incentives which previously weren't available for OTC sunscreen monographs. These are called Tier 1 and Tier 2 OTC order requests, OMARs. The Tier 1 is a fee-based review of new ingredients, or if you want to add a new ingredient to the monograph, or a new indication or therapeutic category as a new monograph, you can now petition FDA to do this. There's an 18-month exclusivity in innovation for the first company to actively receive a grace on a new ingredient, in terms of no one else could market that during that period of time. The fee, it increases annually based on cost of living. For 2023, you pay an upfront fee of $517,000, and it does require the GRACE and MUST guideline data submissions. So in addition to the fee, you have to generate all the data that's required under the GRACE guidelines and the MUST guidelines, and then there are reviews timelines associated, which are statutorily imposed now in terms of how long it takes FDA, these are presented on the right for Tier 1. There's also a Tier 2, which are for drug fact label or condition of use changes. There's no exclusivity for these. This is 2023 fee is $103,000 upfront if you want to change the drug fact label. The timelines are again presented in the little box there for the Tier 1, Tier 2, and I won't go through those, but in average, they're about less than 18 months on average in terms of FDA's review of the data package once all the data is submitted that they require. Recently, on April 10th, FDA did indicate what the formatting and content of OMAR submissions need to be. There's a 60-day comment period on that, which is still in play. But if you're interested in that, take a look. It's very extensive. It's almost like an NDA. So the current status of OTC sunscreen ingredients summary. So the 2021 deemed final order, which is actually a 1999 final monograph, effectively maintains the status quo that was established in 1999 until FDA issues a finalized order. So everything that was grasped in 1999 continued to be as such. The combinations that were indicated or allowed still are in play. The sunscreen products that comply with the 21 deemed final order do not need to be removed from the market. Manufacturers who want to continue marketing sunscreen products that contain active ingredients for which insufficient data exists based on the proposed order, and these are category 3 ingredients, have been requested to submit additional data to FDA, and that's what the consortia, the PCPC, is currently doing for 7 ingredients. There are the new OMAR innovation and ingredient requests. And important to note that the data requirements are very much like NDAs in terms of cost and time. And there's no deadline for FDA to finalize the 2021 proposed order as of today. In terms of what's going on, is there anything on the horizon with new sunscreens? Yes, there is. There's one new ingredient, Parcel Shield, called the USAN name or drug name is bemotrizonal, abbreviated as BEMT. A GRACE determination is currently being sought for this UV filter by DSM at a level of 6%. It's a broad spectrum filter, as can be seen on the right. It has UVB and UVA. It's very high molecular weight, which means that it probably doesn't absorb, and that's a chemical structure there. So it's the first and only, as far as I know, U.S. Sunscreen active ingredient, which is known as a new molecular entity since it hasn't been introduced into the marketplace in the U.S. That's currently being evaluated under FDA's revised GRACE and Maximum usage trial, Pharmacokinetic test guidelines for drug substances, OTCs. Currently, all the clinical studies requested by FDA have been completed, and the preliminary results from the pivotal MUST, which is very important to determine whether or not you're above or below the 0.5 nanograms per mil, and therefore would be have exempted from animal testing studies, have been completed. And I'll go over that in detail so you kind of get a flavor as to what that requires. So let's look at the journey of BMT. This has taken a long time, right? This is 2023. So the time and extent process for accepting foreign actives on OTC monographs was established in 2002. In 2005, there was actually a time extent application submitted to FDA, and FDA reviewed that and determined that BMT is eligible for review as an active ingredient under the monograph. Additional data was submitted by BMT sponsor in 2006. Then, as I indicated earlier, in 2014, the Sunscreen Innovation Act introduced the GRACE and guidelines for TEA ingredients. The non-prescription advisory committee met and indicated what their recommendations were for the types of studies that were required to accept ingredients under the monograph as GRACE. And then FDA proposed a sunscreen order for BMT, indicating its eligibility to be considered for inclusion under the OTC monograph pending the submission of additional data. In 2016, we see that FDA amended the TA process review timelines per Sunscreen Innovation Act mandates. FDA issued the guidance on GRACE, and it also issued the guidance on the format and content of information submitted by any sponsor in support of a TEA or Sunscreen Innovation Act request. There was no further activity on BMT by its sponsor at that point in time. In 2019, FDA issued the final MUST guidance, and then in 2019, FDA met with DSM, and DSM indicated that it was interested in submitting the data to support the inclusion of BMT on the monograph at a level of 6%, and provided FDA did provide feedback in terms of saying that they were supportive and would indicate what studies were required. So from 2019 on, the FDA revised recommendations regarding the remaining studies needed to be completed was obtained. A new BMT USP monograph was drafted because all ingredients on the monograph require USP status, and the one that existed was over 10 years old, and the methods were outdated and obsolete. FDA, the clinical, non-clinical, and SPF studies have been completed and will be submitted in Q2 3 of this year. The full GRAS petition is expected to be submitted in Q3 of this year as well, following FDA feedback of all the studies that we have done. This is precedent setting, so there probably will be an NDAC meeting required to finalize it as an administrative order that allows us to be marketed. And a final GRAS determination is expected in first or second quarter of 2024, following FDA review and possibly NDAC meeting. In terms of the studies that were needed to be supported of a GRAS determination, as you can see, they're very similar to what I indicated are necessary and are part of the guidelines on the GRACE and MUST. They include the chemistry, the human clinical, the non-clinical effectiveness data, and other adverse event data, and document cases in the medical literature regarding the ingredient. So this was what was indicated as what needed to be required. Those tests have been done. The pivotal MUST study, which is looking at after all the other studies have been completed, the absorption of the ingredient in a 4-day pivotal study in various formulations, which are market representative, was conducted under maximal use conditions in 162 subjects, which received 4 applications per day, and several timelines, time intervals rather. What we exposed people to was 2 milligrams per square centimeter of body surface area, 75% of body surface area, and this was an extraordinarily large amount of sunscreen. So 105 grams of sunscreen per day for an average 60 kilogram weight person. So that's a lot of sunscreen, but this is maximum use, worst case. The 0.5 level in terms of threshold was measured, but we went below that to a lower limit of quantification of 0.1, and actually went even below that in terms of half of the lower level of quantification at 0.05 nanograms per mil in order to get a real good read in terms of what was being absorbed and have more precision and accuracy with regards to absorption. And of course, safety evaluations were conducted as this was a human clinical trial. So if you look here, I'm not going to go over the details very much other than saying that there were over 3,722 plasma samples collected from 162 subjects over 4 days. There were 3 formulations, T2, T3, T4, which was oil, lotion, and cream. In terms of absorption, the results were similar across the board in terms of what the levels absorbed were. We're looking at levels below the level of quantification, levels at the lower level of quantification, levels between the 0.5 nanograms per milliliter and the lower level of quantification. So if we look at the overall results, 69% of all the samples collected were below 0.05 nanograms, right? 31% of those samples were below 0.1 nanograms. 28% were below 0.5 nanograms, which is, and then only 3% were either at or above the 0.5 nanogram per mil threshold, which FDA established as that needing additional data. Of that 3%, there were only 4 subjects that were above, and this is preliminary results, but in the final results, it does look like that data will probably be a lot lower, since those time points actually were outliers that actually went back down in the next time they were sampled in terms of they were below 0.5. So anyway, this is great news in terms of there's no absorption. And if you look at the study findings, all the pharmacokinetic, thermal safety, and efficacy studies have been completed for BEMT. The preliminary analysis in 162 subjects indicate that 70% of the samples were below 0.1 nanograms. 97% of the samples, which is a very high number, which is extraordinarily high percentage, which is seldom seen in any clinical study, did not exceed FDA's threshold of 0.5. Adverse events were mild and similar to what you see in all the sunscreens. And the results indicate that maximum topical applications of 6% BMT are safe and do not contribute to meaningful systemic exposure. So in the end, the results appear to be supportive of an FDA draft determination for BMT, which we expect, after we submit the data in Q1, Q2 of 2024. And this will be great news, because that would mean that we have not only 2, but then 3 active ingredients that are considered to be GRACE and allowed to be combined freely amongst each other. And then all the other ingredients that they indicated are being supported by the Sunscreen Consortia. So that being said, I kind of give a glimpse as to what is going on with the existing filters, new filters, the intricacies associated with the data that's required, and in terms of going forward, I'll be more than happy answering questions in the Q&A period. So thank you for your time, and we'll chat again. Thank you. Bye.